Hello, welcome back, friends. This is Lisa Cólon DeLay with the Spark My Muse podcast. Today is an author interview, and I'm interviewing Micha Boyett. She's a return guest. She came and we touched base about The Slow Way, that podcast, and her amazing work she does that I really resonate with, as well as we have a commonality of having a special needs son. And my son has autism, as listeners might know. He's an adult now and living mostly on his own with some help. And her son has Down syndrome and autism as well, and is a younger child than my son. But her book that we're going to get into is called Blessed Are the Rest of Us. I'm loving the title. That's the subtitle, I should say. How Limits and Longing Make Us Whole. I'm hoping we get to connect and engage with this. Thank you, Micha, for being my guest today.
I'm so excited to be here, Lisa, and I've been following your work and reading your work for a while now, so it's fun to be here together.
And so I'll just read the back matter of the book to kind of put into context what you're getting at as a little taste test here. When Micha Boyett's son was born with Down syndrome and later diagnosed with autism, she was drawn into the ancient teachings of the Beatitudes. There she found an invitation to honor her limits in a world that values performance, perfection, and strength over mercy, meekness, and the longing for justice. In Blessed Are the Rest of Us, Boyett invites us, especially those of us who are burned out, tired of performing, living with grief, feeling exhausted or powerless, to discover our wholeness, not in our own accomplishments, but in the dream God has for the world. If that doesn't entice you, nothing will. But this book is really, really quite personal, and it has different vignettes of time where you list the date and the age of your son, Ace. It pulls us through a whole story, not just the Beatitudes, but how your life is going along at these different periods of time. However, my favorite part is probably because I have such a love for the Beatitudes. I love what you've done on page 13, and I was hoping you could explain a little bit of what's going on with this word that we were trying to pronounce before the recording, and what you've done with this rendering, which is just, it's a really lovely way to reimagine what's happening.
Thank you. Yeah, so this is right before the prologue. I have a reimagining of the Beatitudes, and I call it a poem by Jesus of Nazareth. And I use this word that we were laughing about pronunciation. I did not go to seminary. I did not study Greek. So all of this is like, I've read a lot of books and nobody taught me how to say this. But I did just record the audiobook. And so Makati is the plural of the word that we translate as blessed. The singular is Makarios. And it's also a phrase that is called a macarism. And the macarism is basically a pronunciation that expresses a blessing. And it's also an exhortation to live in a particular way. And so I take out that word blessed because I do think that blessed is so overused, especially in modern day Christianity and in the way we think about blessing and being blessed. And I focus in on this Greek word because I think that Makati can be so many different things than what we usually think of as blessed. And I really want the reader to walk away from this book thinking about blessing in a new way. When I list what Jesus said in Matthew 5 in his Beatitudes, I kind of have rewritten according to what I have learned in my research. So, do you want me to read it?
I would love that.
Okay. A poem by Jesus of Nazareth. Makati are the weak ones, the poor in wealth and the poor in soul. They are caretakers of the dream of God. Makati are the ones who grieve. They will be invited to a divine banquet. Makati are the powerless ones and the ones who release their power. They will recognize that the entire earth has always been theirs. Makati are the ones who long for justice that restores and dignifies. They will be filled with whole and mutually dependent love. Makati are the ones who give mercy. They will receive in turn what they have offered in love. Makati are the true ones. They will have eyes to see the spirit of truth. Makati are the ones who serve peace. They will be called kin, safe in God's chosen family. Makati are the ones who suffer for doing good. Their dreams will become like God's dream. Makati are the fearless ones, the rejected or pushed out. They will find joy on the edges, co-working with God, transforming the world in love.
Amen. That's worth the price of the book.
Yeah.
If you're listening out there, that's worth the price of the book. I'm like thinking posters. For some reason, it gets in really deep in the way you're saying it. And it might just be because we get numb to some of the familiar ways the Beatitudes are spoken to us. They're very meaningful, but there's some words you use that help us unfold it and reimagine it in fresh ways. And I guess I'll just skip to the part where I wanted to talk about the dream of God and just converse a little bit about that. This is something that I want to put into my regular vernacular, my regular vocabulary when I talk about what God is up to in the world. We're part of kingdom come now and kingdom come to come because of what Jesus has done and how Jesus has reconciled us to God. And we don't have to wait until heaven to bring kingdom come here, right? I'd love you to just expand a little bit when you say the dream of God, a little bit about what you said in the book. And it doesn't have to be a whole reveal, but it's such a beautiful image. I want to live into that image.
I first heard the dream of God used in a sermon, and it was as my pastor was using the dream of God instead of the kingdom of God, and it just lit me up. I was like, this is it. I mean, I do think some of it is just the tired vernacular that we're used to, but also, and I talk a little bit about this in just the prologue of the book, that like Jesus used the word kingdom because that's how his listeners understood the world. He wanted them to, like, in a world where they were controlled by whatever empire reigned and controlled their daily existence and took their money and, made them feel safe or unsafe. He wanted them to imagine a empire that was controlled by a divine love that cared about their daily existence and cared about the flourishing of everyone and everything. When he used this word kingdom, he wanted their understanding of like their lives to pulsing around this divine love that wanted the best for them. So I think for us, we're in an empire, and there are things we're definitely not able to control or it feels out of control. But the understanding of kingdom doesn't sit with us the same way. And this phrase, the dream of God, is used by Stephanie Spellers, who I really love her work. She's a Episcopal priest and has a special job under like a canon, maybe. I don't know all of my Episcopal language things, but she writes about the dream of God, and she took that phrase from Verna Dozier, who was a lay person who wrote books like in the 70s, 80s in the Episcopal Church. And I love the idea that what Jesus is inviting us to is God's own longing for our lives. God is a God who has dreams and longings. And who has a dream of who we are becoming, a dream of who the world will become, a dream of who humanity will become. And as we like reimagine the kingdom of God in that way, it feels very present to me in a way that kingdom doesn't as much.
Totally agree. Kingdom is about dominion and power and
Hmm.
who's running things. Yes, I get that, and it's powerful. But dream is creative, imaginative, co-creative
Hmm.
maybe, but
Yeah.
lucid dream, I'm thinking.
Yeah.
I'm a
Yeah.
lucid dreamer, and when you think about waking up within the dream, to be able to
Yeah.
have some control about how things are going to go, and thinking about how in a sense we are God's agents in God's lucid dream,
Mm.
and to think
Mm.
about what God is up to in such a dynamic way. We're not waiting for
Yeah.
something,
Right.
hanging on till the rapture or whatever. We have
Yeah.
to put those things aside and be like, what difference are we going to make now? This is the one life. We're put here for a reason, not to wait, though. What you say on page 27, just to kind of expand on this, what Jesus calls the kingdom of God is a dream that exists in the imagination of the divine. It is the intention of God, the original hope for creation, and the ultimate reality for those willing to move our imaginations and intentions towards justice, peace, and inclusion with the help of a divine love that propels us forward. Richard Rohr uses the phrase the really real to communicate the same notion. And the really real is another helpful thing too. What is really going on here? Are we going through the motions of living, or are we keying in and attuning to the really real? What is the thing that really matters? Why are we here? What is the meaning
Yeah.
of this? Is it
Yeah.
just to withstand harm? Is it just to white knuckle through whatever is opposing us, and or the hedonist route where like just
Hmm.
have pleasure? I mean, just eat
Right.
the thing, do the thing, whatever. And those things are all, someone once said, someone famous I should know, to say it right now. I mean, it's going to come to me later, but when we are lacking meaning, we will often seek pleasure. Can't
Mm, that's
find
good.
that meaning, we'll often pleasure seek, but it's this temporary little trick, that
Yeah.
comes up short. But if we're
Yeah.
living in God's dream and the really real, there is so infused with meaning that we wake up, within the dream.
Within the dream. Yeah, I love that, Lisa. And I think that that plays in so well to this definition of Mikari, that this what we usually translate as blessed. And as I spent time with the Beatitudes and read different scholars, I came across this work by the scholar Jonathan Pennington. He talks about in his book, The Sermon on the Mount and Human Flourishing, he talks about how Jesus is using an oratorio device
Mm-hmm.
that was used in the Greco-Roman virtue tradition.
Mm.
And it was a device used over and over where the speaker would stand up and say, I'm going to tell you about how to live a whole and flourishing life. And that's that phrase that we translate as blessed can also be understood in this way as wholeness and flourishing. And when you think about that in terms of the dream God is dreaming for the world, and what it means to live in the really real.
Mm.
It's that invitation into wholeness. And I just read this. I was so delighted. Actually, I'm reading Lori Ferguson Wilbert's new book. Do
Oh,
you know Lori?
oh yeah.
The Understory, and it just came out. And she quotes Andy Crouch, who said at some point in a conversation that flourishing is being magnificently oneself. That's so beautiful and so much in line with the things that I'm talking about here, with this a movement toward wholeness, living in the dream of God, becoming who God dreams of us being, and that is to be magnificently ourselves. Ourselves as God always has intended us to be. Man, and then you start thinking about that in terms of disability and what we've both learned as moms to our sons.
Mhm.
There's there's just so much richness there, especially as we consider how God's love propels us forward.
Mm. Yeah, the magnificently ourselves to get to the point, even nibbling at the edges of what that could mean, is
Yeah.
a salvation.
Yeah.
That is to be saved,
Uh-huh.
because you're saved from your ideas of what are other people thinking. Am I meeting some expectation, or am I pleasing to other people? Or the judgment is removed because you are just
Mm.
liberated into your own
Yeah.
wholeness, right?
Right.
That speaks a lot to our special kids who sometimes are stripped of their dignity even while they're being treated with kindness. They can still be like, hey, little buddy.
Mhm.
And you know that they already are aware of what's happening. I know with and this happened when my son was nonverbal. Because you can't speak, people think you can't hear. And
Mhm.
so they'll speak more loudly. And if they reversed it, they wouldn't really want to be treated that way, because it's to be treated as less, or with pity instead of with
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
compassion. And
Yeah.
there's this thing that we get to see in real time with our kids, where we're thinking that's not them getting to be themselves. Them getting to be
Mhm.
themselves is being celebrated for exactly how they come into the
Yes.
world and express themselves in the world, warts and all, which is what we want too. We want to be able to
Mhm.
show up authentically, right?
Yeah.
I know with autism, there's the meltdowns and the overwhelm and things like that, and you don't want them to go into disconnection. Ultimately,
Yeah.
you're trying to get them into wholeness, but wholeness amongst us, amongst community,
Right.
and
Right.
have them in a community that is like, there's nothing wrong with you. We love you. You don't have to conform to what we want. We will adapt. We will adapt for what you need. If you need to lie down on the ground to be here in the church service,
Mhm.
cool. If
Yeah.
you kowtow to the expectations, you don't come into your wholeness and fullness, because you're not able to be fully yourself.
That's right. And yeah, I mean, I think that this plays out in when we talk about inclusion in schools, inclusion at church.
Mm-hmm.
What does it mean? I have so I do besides the slow way, I do another podcast that's called The Lucky Few.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been co-hosting this with two other women who are moms of kids with Down syndrome for the past 6 years. Endless amounts of conversations and getting to interview experts and thinking about education, thinking about inclusion and acceptance.
Mm-hmm.
One of my co-hosts, Heather Avis, wrote a children's book a couple of years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the lines that they say over and over, it's like these kids putting on a play, and there's a lot of different children who come up with different disabilities presented.
Mm-hmm.
And they say, exactly who you are is exactly who we pick.
Mm-hmm.
I love that phrase. I love that thinking of not this passive, like, you can come be in this space and good on us for like accepting you, for making noises during church. Like, we're such nice people. But like, no, we want you to be fully yourself as we worship, because we believe that what you have to offer is exactly what we need, that we can learn from you in the same way that you can learn from us. There's so much power in that, like real inclusion. Real inclusion is, we want you here and you don't have to change to be good enough to be here with us. One of the things that I've gotten to do over the years, even before, so Ace is my youngest. So even when he was a baby and his brothers were in elementary school, I put together this presentation where I would go to classrooms and talk about disability, talk about the science of Down syndrome, and talk about one of the things that I wanted to make sure people heard from me, especially kids, was that and I think this is easier when thinking about Down syndrome, but Down syndrome for Ace is in every single cell of his body. He had the third copy of the 21st chromosome from the first cell that ever existed that God put together. And then when that cell separated, there were two cells with three copies of the 21st chromosome. And Ace would not be himself if he didn't have it. And that's something that I always say to the kids that I talk to about it. I am so glad that Ace has Down syndrome because I want him to be himself. And I love that he's himself. And this is who he is.
That people are uncomfortable with disability, with weakness, and it has to be healed, or it has to be like us, and so I like that we should disrupt that, because what do we know about wholeness? you know like we're talking about being fully yourself. So if fully yourself, maybe we don't know quite what that is, but it doesn't have to look like what's normal. And but that also speaks to our own weaknesses and what we've been afraid and vulnerable about.
Yeah. Yeah. I was with a friend recently who does some teaching on the Enneagram, and she had been invited into this kind of corporate situation where she was speaking to a group of people in this business setting. She was going through the Enneagram basics and started kind of talking about weaknesses for each type. And then at a break, the big boss pulled her aside and was like, if we could just not talk about weaknesses. We really like to focus on the positive here. And it's just like this, it's so American. It's so just kind of Western capitalistic culture that we are so terrified of our weaknesses. So, of course, those of us who are non disabled are terrified of disability because it exposes what is actually true about all of us, that we need each other, that we need mutual dependence on one another, that none of us have it all together. And it's just that those of us who aren't disabled yet, because we probably will be disabled at some point in our life, can pretend longer
Right.
that we don't have weaknesses.
Ah, that's so well said. That is so well said. That Are we really thinking that we're not going to get hurt, diseased, old?
Yeah, old.
Maybe, maybe not, but chances are extremely likely we'll be at some point at least partially disabled. And so
Hmm.
being normal and healthy is actually rare. It's the minority for sure,
Mm.
if you consider the span of human life.
Yeah.
And I have seen people be repulsed, embarrassed, and ashamed when they see my son. And it took me a little while to realize that's their reflection. He shows them a mirror of themselves.
Yes.
That's not about him.
Hmm.
He's not aware. He's living his life. He's living his
Yep.
life. And it's not to say that he hasn't struggled with self-image problems, self-worth problems, because the comparison, he is aware enough and he can speak enough
Yeah.
now to tell me, why am I different? And why did someone say this to me? And I'll say, we're all different. I wear glasses. I can't spell worth crap. There's stuff I just cannot do. I have to be okay with that. And you have autism and you're going to be okay. You have a lot of really cool skills. You're such a neat person. And he's like, I am. I'm like, yes, of course. But it's like that thing where people see, like, oh no, that must be so embarrassing,
Hmm.
or ew, or something.
Yeah. Yeah.
You see that. And only for a short time made me like really upset, like, hey, that's somebody I love. And then I thought, oh wow, this is out in the open, who they are,
Yeah.
what they feel
Yeah.
about themselves, which is so sad, which is so sad,
Yeah.
because God loves all that in them.
Yeah. And it's something interesting. My husband said to me, at some book event, I was talking about this idea, and afterwards he was like, I think the word you're looking for is critique. Like,
Oh,
Ace's life is a critique of the culture around him,
oh,
and it's pointing to what everybody's getting wrong. I think that that's been one of the gifts in the visual cues on his face of Down syndrome,
yeah.
that from the beginning of living my life with him, we've been stared at. He's been stared at.
Mhm.
And I've started to think of even just going to the store with him, showing up at school events with him, playing at the park with him. All of that is advocacy,
Mm.
because he, in being himself, is advocating for himself. And it's also like, if people invite him into their lives, they will experience that critique, that critique of how they live,
Mm.
and be invited into something richer and, more beautiful.
This is exactly what it is. It is the gospel that comes to us from the margins. Ace
Mhm.
has the gospel for us. My son Nathan has the gospel
Mhm.
for us. The people on the margins, they bring the gospel to us. And that's the only place where it truly comes in and impacts. It comes from the outside and it turns the stuff upside down.
Yep.
And if you don't realize that the gospel comes from the margins where you're not expecting it, you'll miss it. You'll think the opposite, And so when it's uncomfortable and disruptive, it's like it's doing its work. God's doing the holy work of disrupting what we think of as humanity or weakness. And
Yeah.
meekness I wanted to speak to also.
Yeah, yeah.
On page 68, I love this. Though meekness can certainly be defined as a lack of strength, there's also a kind of meekness we can choose for ourselves, meekness as a spiritual practice. And that's just right there. I could savor that for 10 minutes.
Mm.
It's having access to power but choosing not to wield it for oneself. It's holding back our control, our comfort, our voice in order to give that privilege to another. It's the advocating, giving testimony on behalf of one who doesn't speak the language of those in authority, the one who doesn't have time or energy to push for justice on their own behalf, or the one whose voice has been deemed by those in places of influence as unworthy of being heard. It's a person in position of power who thinks creatively enough to notice where and how that power can be shared. The word we translate as meek comes from the Greek word pros. It refers to a wild animal that has been tamed, often a horse broken in, trained, and taken to war. Meekness is an invitation to be tamed, to lay our power down, to move towards gentleness and nonviolence, especially when the other options are available to us. Meekness requires releasing our hold and control. It asks us to join the powerless in the back of the line, move back and forth into change. Can you expand at all on that or dive in?
Yeah, yeah. I think that there is this, I do feel like meekness is a word that's so rarely used,
Mm-hmm.
and when it is used, it's just seen as weakness, or as like just a passive, like getting beat up kind
Mm-hmm.
of, um like, not even as a virtue, but just like, a meek person who lets the world stomp all over them. And so there were a lot of, like, as I came to the Beatitudes, there were a lot of things that I would naturally gravitate toward, as I, like, in my, just from reading it and being around it growing up in church. And meekness was never one that I was
Mm-hmm.
like, oh, yes, yes, this really rings true. I was really delighted as I kind of dug into meekness, like this idea of having power but choosing not to wield it rings so true for me, especially like as I was working on this book, and really like the big ideas of this book in 2020, um, during lockdown, and during the Black Lives Matter movement coming to, like, a head that summer,
Mm-hmm.
and thinking about my own white privilege, and what does it mean to live as an anti-racist, and what does it mean for me to recognize where I've always had power, and how I can give up that power. And then thinking about it in terms of Ace, who was born without power, and
Mhm.
in a lot of ways in the world, especially because of his development and the fact that he is still non-speaking,
Mhm.
and a lot of things, he has a lot of challenges in his life. Um, like, I know what it is to push for power on his behalf,
Mhm.
like to try to get the powers and authority to give some power to him.
Right.
And how do I take that into the rest of my life, as a upper middle class white woman and as a straight woman? All of those things, that there are so many people living without power in our society. And here I am in my cozy home with my 3 kids and a dog and a stable marriage, and I have so much power to lay down and give to others. And I think it's just been an image and a metaphor for me of what it looks like to start moving toward justice,
Mm.
and the kind of hungering and thirsting for justice that Jesus talks about in the Beatitudes.
Mm.
And you think about like what Jesus, it wasn't just the choice to lay down his power. It took this imagination.
Mm.
It took this creativity of thought that he could imagine a world where women had a voice.
Mhm.
And with that imagination, he sent the Samaritan woman off to proclaim, the imagination it took to even say, I'm thinking about Mary and Martha,
Mhm.
that Mary's chosen the better thing by sitting and listening and learning, when that was not an action that women should be taking.
Mm.
And then I think about, like, in the book, I talk about Lazarus. I tell this story of listening to a sermon. Well, Nadia Bolz-Weber was preaching, and she was asking the question of why Lazarus never speaks
Mm.
in all of these stories, and asks the question of whether or not Lazarus was a nonverbal man who possibly had Down syndrome. To allow us to imagine that, like, that comes back to Jesus's creativity as well, and his choice. Like, who am I gonna give life to?
Mm.
I'm gonna give it to this person without power. It feels so Jesus to us because that is how Jesus did things over and over and over, giving up power and giving it to somebody else.
As we pick a spot here to wind down, I wanted to see if there was any special nugget of the book that we didn't cover, something you wanted to bring out that you hope readers don't miss, potential readers don't miss when they get your book.
Mm. The passage that comes right after the Beatitudes, where Jesus starts his real Sermon on the Mount saying, "You are the light of the world." And I I think about this image by Scott Erickson, who's a modern iconographer, and he has this drawing that's called Shipwreck Lighthouse,
Mm.
and it's a lighthouse that is built on an island, and you can see under the island with that the island is actually made of a wrecked ship upside down.
Mm.
And and then land has grown over it,
Mm.
and then the lighthouse is standing on it. My desire for this book is that all of us, whatever our circumstances, I think the power of the Beatitudes is that it speaks to all of our lives, because it's a poem about pain and about our longings and about what God dreams of for us,
Mm.
not as this transactional blessing, like if you do these things, then God's going to give you what you want, but as this invitation into wholeness. And and I love that Jesus goes directly into this "you are the light of the world" idea, because he isn't saying you will be the light of the world, once you get your stuff together, like once you stop grieving and stop being meek and, stop suffering for doing good. But in the midst of all of those limits and all of those longings, you are the light of the world.
Mm.
I think that image of this, we all have the shipwrecks in our lives. We all have the pain that never goes away. But the healing is the island that's built on top of it. The healing is the light that grows out of it. That's what we're invited in the dream of God to share with the world, is that our lights shine not in spite of the pain of our lives, but because of the pain of our lives. And that's where God is actively working and actively bringing God's dream into something beautiful.
Mm. Well said, Micah. It's a prophetic call. It's something that we ought to be mindful of, remind ourselves of, and step into. And it's an everyday thing. It's not like okay, today I'm going to do that, and that means we're settled up now. We do that every day. So, where can people find you that are unfamiliar with your work? Where's some of the best places?
Yeah. I have a Substack newsletter that comes out once a week. It's called The Slow Way. And it is also available in podcast form. So you can subscribe to the podcast. It's also called The Slow Way. It's a short, like 15 to 20 minutes, a reflection and a practice, some kind of prayer practice. Mm-hmm. And I'm also, I mentioned the Lucky Few podcast, which is much more kind of wild, energetic women talking to each other about Down syndrome podcast. But we interview a lot of experts, and it's been a really fun ride to be able to speak not just to the Down syndrome community, but the greater disability community. Mm-hmm. And then I'm on Instagram at Micha Boyett, MichaBoyett. And then this book, Blessed Are the Rest of Us, is available wherever books are sold. So you can find it Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Target. You can find it at, what's it called? Bookshop.org for your independent bookseller.
Yeah.
And yeah, I would love for your listeners to pick it up.
And I would recommend it. Blessed Are the Rest of Us, How Limits and Longing Make Us Whole. For anybody listening, we did the 1 or 2 taste buds of this book. There is so much more we could have covered in this book. There is a lot of personal stuff. And I know you had mentioned about the dreaded chapter 7 in the book. We didn't even get near that. And
no,
that's worth a whole podcast in itself. There's a lot in here we didn't even touch on, but what we did is pretty powerful too. So thank you so much for coming along and sharing.
I just feel like you're such a kindred, Lisa, and getting to have conversations about the spiritual parts of this book and the just raising a child who's disabled. Like all of that is really powerful stuff. So thanks.